Thanks for tuning in to Liberacion Army Radio. This is episode 10 of our podcast.
This episode will air on June 17th, 2025.
My name is Ryan. I use they, them pronouns. I am a therapist with a background in psychology, nonprofit, and social work.
Hi, this is Ome. I accept all pronouns. I'm a student completing my political science and sociology double major.
Today we will be talking about actions this week, the Mexican court case in the U.S. Supreme Court against gun manufacturers. Next, we'll cover our usual Genocide Watch update and a lot of news coming out of Mexico. Finally, our general topic for today is how to radicalize your friends and family, or for short, leftist conversion therapy.
Today, on Spotify, you'll be able to find our poll. And the poll question for today is: are there any topics that you're interested in for this podcast? If you're not on Spotify, feel free to comment this in the comment section of anywhere that you are hearing this podcast, and we will be able to take that data as well. Now, I'm going to talk about social movements and political actions this week, but before I do that, I want to talk about a family friend of mine that was impacted this weekend by police violence and racial profiling. My family friend, her name is Keisha, and her younger brother, Edward Lynch, was killed on Saturday night by Bethany police in Oklahoma. The family is currently looking to cover the cost of funeral expenses as well as looking for some kind of attention from mainstream media because there's literally not a single article written about this anywhere that you can find online, including local articles. There will be a fundraiser link in the show notes as well as my video about this on TikTok. And if you could share the video on TikTok and comment a news media outlet somewhere, that would be great. And now for actions. In Washington, D.C., we have No War on Iran on June 18th at 6 p.m. in the White House via Party for Socialism and Liberation, D.C. In New York, we have No War on Iran on June 18th as well at 6 p.m. in Bryant Park at the New York Plaza steps. In the Bay Area, we have the Juneteenth Liberation Discussion and Celebration in San Francisco and Oakland on different days and different times. Please check their IG at PSL Bay Area. They're also organizing against billionaires and deportations. They have a meeting on June 20th at the Oakland Liberation Center at 1499 Fruitvale Avenue. In Los Angeles, there's No War on Iran on June 18th at 5 p.m. Wilshire Federal Building or 11000 Wilshire Boulevard. There's also the ongoing rebellion in LA. Make sure that you pop out. PSL is the primary organizer of that rebellion. In Chicago, we have a Juneteenth barbecue and political education on June 21st at 2 p.m. in Douglas Park at 1401 South Sacramento Drive. They're also organizing a meeting for ICE Out on June 20th at 6 p.m. For international, there have been various obstacles for the March to Gaza, and there's a call for international support. They're asking for people to raise awareness about freeing Dr. Hisham al-Gawi, I'm not sure if I said that correctly, and all of the Global March to Gaza detained peace activists in Egypt. Please visit marchtogaza.net to learn more about this action. It's going to be in the breaking news section, which is a banner at the top of their website. Additionally, if you didn't already know, the Freedom Flotilla did not successfully break the siege on Gaza, but they did raise a significant amount of awareness, and the activists, the majority of them have either been returned to their home country or are seeking support from the international community to call for their liberation. So please check with them to see which ones are currently still being held in Israeli detention. Every once in a while, I'm going to spotlight an organization or work that some of my mutuals are doing. Today, I'm going to be spotlighting VC Defensa. This is led by TacoDPollo or Leo. TacoDPollo and VC Defensa are on Instagram, and it's located at the Lab 805. The lab is based out of Oxnard, California, which is in Southern California. They do a variety of different organizing with Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as other left-wing coalitions. Please go and check them out. This Thursday, they have a meeting, and this is a KYR and organizing meeting. at 432 North Ventura Avenue, Unit 101 Ventura, from 7 to 9 p.m. They also have a variety of different other volunteering meetings throughout the week, so please get in touch. Follow at VC Defensa or at the Lab 805 or at Taco de Pollo. And Taco de Pollo is just D, no DE. Quick note about our international politics and politics section and updates. Just so you know, this originally was recorded to publish on June 9th, so it's technically a little bit outdated. However, the news out of the area hasn't really dramatically changed, so I decided to leave it as is. And I will explain at the end of this podcast before closing why I wasn't able to publish it right away and why you've missed a couple episodes of Liberacion Army Radio. But I just wanted to insert that note here so that you're aware that we're speaking from whenever we say a couple days ago, what we're really talking about is June 7th or 8th. But we'll start with an update on Mexico. Did you hear about the court case that the Supreme Court was handling on behalf of Mexico regarding the gun legislation?
I have not.
So Mexico just sued gun manufacturers through the American Supreme Court. And basically, what they're trying to do is make the case that gun manufacturers are equally as complicit for the guns that are entering Mexico and ultimately landing in cartel hands. And the Department of Justice actually recognized in January this year through a special report that 75% of weapons in Mexican cartels are at least in origin from the US, legally distributed guns, I should say. The others, the illegal ones that are not from legal distribution, still are mostly American in origin. Some of them are actually originating from Israel, which is super weird if you think about how far Israel is to Mexico. Um, but in any case, the Supreme Court denied that the Mexican government was in the right and that the manufacturers were legally liable for aiding and abetting the guns entering Mexico and ultimately being responsible for gun deaths in Mexico.
So does this mean that Mexico gets some sort of like what are they suing for money, or do you think they're suing for like policy change
Um,
or both?
well, what MSNBC is saying is that this upholds a federal statute. And typically, when people are talking about federal statute, they're talking about the right to bear arms, the constitutional amendment. And so I think that one of the primary things that Mexico is seeking is to sort of support the cases of gun violence in the US, if that makes sense. Sort of indirectly, but it kind of seems that way to me. This isn't like a suit to get money. They're not like looking for money. What they're looking for is for a federal intervention in the US to more reasonably regulate guns. Gun regulation is like one of those things that like affects so many people. It doesn't just affect Americans, and I think a lot of people think of it as like an American centralized issue, but it's actually probably worse um in Mexico because in Mexico guns are actually not legal. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, in Mexico guns are not legal. They're not legal for day-to-day use. I think only certain hunting weapons can be used and only in very few counties.
It's really interesting because I remember the last time that we were in Mexico, the only guns that I saw were like the really heavy stuff that the military police.
The Mexican National Guard.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Mexican
It's either
National.
like that or nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, and nobody's armed in Mexico except for the cartel and the National Guard. And that's like it's also why we don't really have school shootings in Mexico. It's because there's no legal weapons. There's not like a lot of legal avenues to access weapons. Most of the weapons that Mexicans still have are generationally passed down, and they're from the Mexico US war actually. So like that's like the average weapon in Mexico. It's not like you know, an AK-47 or a modern day like machine gun or something like that. And that's like the kind of weapons that are in cartel hands. Not to mention like tanks and helicopters. Like
Hmm.
military grade equipments are also entering cartel hands. And I think that's something that people don't really think about. Like they literally have helicopters out there. Like that's why Mexico's suing is because it's not just like that a couple guns are getting over the border. It's like military grade equipment. Why is Israeli military grade equipment and Israeli technology making it all the way into Mexico into cartel hands? Like that has to be, at least complicit with the American government to whatever degree.
That's crazy because I thought Israel got most of their weapons from America, but it sounds like
They manufacture some too.
they make some too. Hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably because it's pretty expensive. I think people sort of view genocide primarily from like a shock element. But one of the reasons that genocides typically end, and this is something that, is kind of controversial for me to say, but the fact of the matter is that like a lot of the times it's economics that stops genocides from happening. The people can't afford to continue to do them.
War is
And
very expensive.
yeah, war is very expensive, and it's mostly expensive for the general public. It's
Hmm.
not really expensive for the people who are conducting the wars. In fact, a lot of the times it's lucrative for them.
Hmm.
And like Great Depressions can be manufactured, and they're great for the economics of the wealthy. Like they
Hmm.
always benefit from these kinds of things. But when it comes to specifically Israel, they have to manufacture some percentage of their weapons because they can't rely entirely on the United States just because of economics. It's not like one of those things where they wouldn't if they could. It's literally that if they had the money, it would be easier for them to buy them for sure, because I think weapons also like they don't have that long of a lifespan. If you think about it, like they're weapons of literal war. Like their wear and tear is like very, very high. So a lot of it in a lot of cases, like they also get stolen, and like things happen to
Hmm.
weapons in war. Like they're not like the Israeli military is notoriously horrible with like how they handle their weapons in general. So a lot of the times they get taken from them, they get damaged by, the resistance forces, etc.
Hmm.
And so like what we see is that these weapons just don't have a long lifespan. So Israel has to like consume that at an incredibly high rate because they don't have a high caliber of like militants. Their militants are not good soldiers. They're horrible, horrible at what they do, and they're horrible people. So you have that, and their rate of consumption is so high that they have to manufacture some of them at home, and it just is cheaper that way. Also, did you hear that Kilmar Abrego Garcia is returning to the United States?
Yeah, and I heard that they're gonna try to hit him with some criminal charges when he gets here.
Yeah, they're manufacturing them, and basically the thing is that if Kilmar Abrego Garcia is in the process of going through like a federal court case, he technically becomes then deportable. So Trump is
Oh,
basically trying to do this in reverse order by the book to
oh,
justify his deportation. So like him
damn.
even being investigated is grounds for him being deported. That's why he's doing it. It's not because like this is not a good thing still. Even if he's found not guilty, even if his like record's completely clear, he's manufacturing consent to deport deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And honestly, if Trump gets away with it this way, then what's going to happen is that he's going to do this way with any other people he wants to deport.
Or he's so like hell bent on getting him out of here.
I really don't know.
He was like the wrong guy to begin with.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with,
Now it's just like the principle of it at
well,
this point.
I mean, I really want to spend a lot more time talking about the LA protests because have you seen them?
A little bit, yeah.
So Trump's initial statement, and this is true, Democrats say this too, that they're just going to deport criminals.
Hmm.
And what ends up happening is that the American government will indiscriminately racially profile people, and they'll deport them. We can make the argument that Obama was a little bit more discriminate than Trump is about deportations. We can say that. But to be completely honest with you, I think it's bullshit. Like, I think that at the end of the day, both of them are like really, really indiscriminate. And what we're seeing with the LA protests is that like they're like indiscriminately arresting like anybody who looks remotely Mexican,
Hmm.
specifically Mexican. And this is the thing is that like Mexican people were not even technically the targets of these raids initially. The majority of the targets of these raids, according to Trump, were going to be Salvadorans, Venezuelans, people on the watch lists, etc., not Mexican people. That
Hmm.
was not originally going to be the people that he was planning on targeting. But we see now that in fact he was targeting Mexicans, which is what I
Hmm.
always say to Mexican people when they like are like right leaning or whatever. I'm like, yeah, you could say that like he's saying a lot of things, But you really need to look at like history at who these raids typically target. And it's almost always the brunt of ICE raids are almost always on the Mexican community. Because I think people forget this, but the majority of the undocumented migrants that are in the United States are Mexican. And the majority of migrants in the United States are Mexican. So like anytime that like ICE is being rolled out or DHS is doing anything or like the DEA is doing anything, it's almost always related to Mexican foreign policy. So like it's really important to understand that like we really do have to stand in solidarity with all migrant communities as Mexican people
Mm.
because everything is going to affect us even if any politician says that it's not going to. So, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, shout out to LA. Have you seen the cars that they've been burning?
Yeah, they're
They
really going all out.
Yeah, they blew up 4 different Waymo cars.
Nice. We love that.
Yeah, they Molotov them, which is like Molotov is a device after my own heart because that's like what Mexicans love to use, especially on the Israeli embassy in Mexico. Whenever anything gets out of control, the first thing they do is whip out a Molotov. So it's kind of interesting to see a Molotov being used. I haven't seen a Molotov being used in a protest in a really long time, like in the United States specifically. And there's already like I even made a video about like how there's all this protest shaming. But what people don't know about Waymo, and I want to put this on wax. So if you see people protest shaming people who are blowing up these Waymo cars,
Fuck Waymo.
Waymo is owned by Alphabet Inc. Okay, which is Google. It's a Google. That's the Google proprietary company. Like they're like the parent company of like a bunch of other different companies. And Waymo is owned by Alphabet Inc., which is Google. The CEO is actively coordinating with DHS to help them with these ICE raids. In my opinion, Waymo cars legitimate target. Just
They
saying.
got all those cameras on them. They use them for like, identifying people and that's what they're
I'm
for. They're like moving surveillance
right.
things, literally.
I'm not endorsing violence on this podcast, and for legal reasons, I don't encourage you to participate in the destruction of property, but in terms of what legitimate targets are in terms of morality, I can totally see why people are legitimately targeting Waymo vehicles, and it's because they are in bed with DHS. Like,
Hmm.
absolutely ridiculous. Ridiculous. These cars are ridiculous. And they're so surveillance statey, and they don't even work. They hold up traffic. They're horrible. They gentrify the neighborhood. They like take people's jobs
Hmm.
and they're very dangerous. Also, for people who are blowing them up and who are present at the LA protests, if you hear this, please make sure that you bring a respirator if you're around the vehicles and the fumes, because those are very dangerous fumes. They have lithium ion batteries. And I already saw one of them blow up, and a lot of people were really, really close to the car. They usually don't blow up lithium ion batteries because of the way that they're built, but they can blow up, so just beware and also don't inhale the fumes. All right, do you want to give us our usual genocide update?
We'll start with Palestine. Ongoing violence at the U.S. Israel backed aid distribution sites, where Israeli troops will open fire at Palestinians seeking aid, which we talked about last week as well. The aid hubs are set up inside Israeli military zones where independent media have no access, and the UN is calling this, quote, humanitarian washing, which I think is very apt because they're making it seem like they're, doing the good thing, but they're actually not.
Yeah, they're mercenaries.
Yeah. But speaking of Israeli meddling, have you heard that they've increased their PR budget?
I didn't hear that they have increased their PR budget.
Yeah, they've increased their PR. Israel has increased their PR budget by 20 times this year to 150 million to sway public opinion against Gaza. So this money goes towards paying influencers, PR firms, pro-Israel bots to present Israel as victims, as safe, as LGBT friendly, as a hot vacation spot, and so on. One of their target audiences is actually Christian evangelicals. Um, and evangelical influencers because they give the illusion that Israel's land theft has some kind of biblical history to it. But
So that's the usual Hasbara point.
yeah,
Hasbara, by the way, is the Israeli type of propaganda campaign that they do.
yeah, and they teach it in their schools
Hmm.
too. But there's a lot of influencers out there. I think Netanyahu, when he came to meet with Trump the last time, he also met with some influencers, and they had like a strategy meeting about how to, push some of these narratives.
That reminds me, Sad Francisco, who's a podcaster also out of the Bay Area, he just released a short video on TikTok. I really recommend people go and check it out. But basically, Kaylani just got kicked out of the San Francisco, like a San Francisco queer pride
Yeah, I saw that.
event situation, and it's a concert.
Hmm.
And her and one other queer pro Palestine artist pulled out of the event, and a bunch of people stayed. And I bet you those are all Zionists.
Oh yeah,
Speaking of Hasbara, in any case.
I heard about that. Yeah, I don't know if this is easy to find out, but obviously Israel is not directly paying influencers. They're paying PR firms who are paying influencers.
Well, the best way to find out, I would say that if your favorite influencer is completely silent on Palestine and hasn't said anything on Palestine, or begins to randomly start talking about Israel, then I would say that's like a pretty obvious way. But I'm not sure if our listeners are going to be the targets for that. Just as a heads up, Aaron Parnas, who is known for reporting quote unquote news, he is actually a huge Zionist. So definitely don't follow him. He would willingly do Hasbara propaganda for free. So just
Hmm.
keep that in mind.
Yeah, yeah. And moving on to Sudan, not much to update, except that Sudan is one of 12 countries that landed on Trump's travel ban, whose nationals are fully restricted from traveling to the US, along with Congo, actually. So that's recent, maybe in the
Wow.
last couple of weeks.
Committing genocide on them just for them to not be allowed to come to this country.
Yeah. There's actually a few interesting. Laos is on there.
That one's kind of not surprising.
Haiti
That
is
one's
on
also not
there.
surprising.
Libya,
You know that the
Iran is
you
on
know
there.
that black Muslim Nation of Islam folks are also travel, like they have travel restrictions. They're on the watch list.
Yeah,
Those are like black Americans there that are on the
it's pretty wild. It's pretty, but this is recent. The 12 countries on the travel ban. Um, but yeah, not too many updates on Sudan. And with Congo, we've been reporting on former President Joseph Kabila the last couple podcasts since his immunity was lifted for treason charges and connections to M23 rebels. But in the last week, Congolese authorities have banned local media from covering or interviewing him and
Mm.
members of his party.
Mm.
M23 is saying that they will not abide by the ban in parts of the country under its control, though, so we'll see how this pans out. Regardless, it seems like he is still in Goma, which is mostly an M23 controlled area.
Nice.
So that's,
Kabila's being his usual sleazy self, I see.
yeah, that's the Congo update.
So
So it's been hard to see to get news because of that ban.
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
For Salvador, I included Salvador on the Genocide Watch because things are sort of picking up tempo over there. And the reason that I think it's important to put it on here early is because I really do think that the CCOP prison is the initial stages of a genocide. The detention of human rights activist Ruth Lopez began because rumors are circulating that Bukele is collaborating with the cartels to monopolize the drug industry.
Damn, he's always up to something.
Nayib Bukele?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but he actually started out as a part of the Salvadoran party that was originally a communist and left wing populist party. And he moved into the right wing coalition over time.
Do we know why?
He's just a grifter. He was like
Oh.
he's kind of like the ACP, like These are people who are truly like conservative,
Mm-hmm.
and they just used the name of communism to advance their political career because the National Liberation Front, which is the Salvadoran left-wing communist populist party, they were probably one of the most popular parties in Salvador for a really long time, and they oppose the American-backed dictatorships that they have had installed. But honestly, Bukele is just another American-backed dictator in Salvador.
Mm.
They're kind of going through the same cycles that the U.S. or that Mexico what has experienced from the U.S.
Okay. Well, hopefully this arc leads in the same direction
Hopefully, but
as Mexico.
they're like probably in the heat of everything right now.
Yeah.
And the worst part is that like it kind of looks like it looks okay because there's not as much crime on the ground. But like people are paying for this inside of those prisons. It's just
Yeah.
crime that people can't see.
Mm-hmm.
Like Bukele is taking out like his his opposition, his drug cartel opposition. Like to see that kind of political action is actually really so wild to see. But yeah, Ruth Lopez, if you're interested in supporting her, then I highly encourage you to make her case more high profile. She basically was thrown into prison for just being an activist, literally for just advocating for human rights.
Mm.
That's it. She didn't do anything bad. There was no like dissent or anything like that. Literally just like doing her like holding her little corner, you know. Okay, I'm going to run through Mexican politics updates quickly because there's a lot of them. Did you hear about the new president of the Mexican Supreme Court after the elections of the on the judicial reform?
No. They got those results quick, though.
Oh yeah, well it's kind of like a presidential election. They did it quick. So his name is Hugo Aguilar, and I'm going to read off his agenda. These are quotes, but they're translated. The only thing that's missing are like the point by point lines that he has. So like next point, that I didn't include that in here, but there's essentially 6 or 7 different points that he believes in as president of the Supreme Court. He's a Mixtec indigenous person coming out of Oaxaca. So his agenda is this is his quotes: constructing a pluricultural justice system, which means providing justice to indigenous groups guaranteeing rights as subjects of public rights recently codified into the Mexican Constitution. A humanist approach, not losing sight that behind every conflict and legal subject there are people, communities, and populations whose future is affected by every resolution. We mustn't lose the dimension of justice, the human dimension of justice. Justice favorable to the environment is losing its capability of resilience and recuperation. We must give the environment a focus of human rights to all elements. The fourth point is justice close to the people. It must be preponderant. In other words, this is my addition, of the utmost importance to collective interests and above individual interests, especially those that look to monetize off of collective interests. Next is a substantive justice for women and the perspective of gender. Women are in a much more vulnerable position within our society, and it requires criteria that generates conditions to enjoy their rights in full. Real and truth in justice, a justice which abandons the legal truth to find the truth that truly transforms the lives of those in our country. Last is the intercultural justice, which invokes new methods and a new vision of rights and justice. We need a court with ministers that are willing to go to different parts of the territory, who understand reality there, and that their sentences are reflections of the reality that contributes to justice in this country. Which is the last point is my favorite point. That he's like, you got to go out there and you've got to see your sentence be carried out.
Do you know how much did he win by? Or was it like close or anything like that?
Um, I don't know the details, but I can tell you, not like officially Morena. He's all the justices are not like technically politically tied, but they have endorsements by specific political parties.
Mm.
And I can tell you that Morena endorsed candidates received like the overwhelming majority of votes. I want to say it was like almost all 13 million, but it's partially because the PRI and the PAN and the right wing coalition called for people not to vote.
Oh,
so,
right.
so it's not like,
So, like, only their people didn't vote.
yeah. I
That
know
sure
they,
backfired.
yeah, I know they shot themselves in the foot a little bit. And then the thing is that Mexico only needs 10% of the vote for it to be recognized. If they wanted it to be annulled, then they would have to have more than that. And 13% showed up, so it's still a valid election, even though they didn't, they didn't want it to be. And it's funny too because the heads of the PRI and the PAN and the right wing coalition, Movimiento Ciudadano, they all went out to vote and they like took pictures and stuff of themselves voting. Like, why would they do that?
Hmm.
um, Turned it into a little photo op. Okay.
For the
So also,
gram.
huh?
For the gram.
For literally for the gram, but they told everybody else not to do it for the gram. Okay, so there's an illegal deforestation in Yucatan. The facts are that the municipal that's in control of the area is Merida. And this area, this town is called the Chablekal, where the deforestation is occurring. Cecilia Patron Laviada is the mayor of Merida, and she is of PAN. Surprise, surprise.
Hmm.
The right wing coalition. How can you help? If you're in Mexico, get in touch with local representatives and distribute information about this deforestation project. This is an illegal deforestation project that's going to have huge ramifications for the environment. So please look into this. And if you're in the US, always denounce US intervention. The ban is backed by the US. And there is a collection of like people who are in charge of this municipal, and there are American investors that are on the like coalition. They have a legal say in what happens to that territory for reasons that are beyond me because this is actually protected territory in Chablekal.
Hmm.
Right?
Are they doing it to like build
Yeah, they're trying to
oh,
build. I think they want to build. I don't remember exactly what they want to build there, but it's something that's like not helpful.
a resort or something?
I'm not sure if this is the same project, but last year the PRI and the PAN were trying to build in Yucatan some houses, some like really, really wealthy, like elite, like mini mansions basically. People do not need that out there because there's a huge class disparity in this area because of the tourism and
Hmm.
touristification. So like there's like gentrification happening there and like anyway. But yeah, I think this might be the same product, but I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. But I think that's what they're trying to build. They're like mini mansions.
Hmm.
Also, water rights in Jalisco are being threatened. Movimiento Ciudadano has refused an audit of SIAPA, or the Intermunicipal System of Water Services. Mariana Casillas, a student candidate for the left wing coalition, so she's basically trying to earn I think, a deputy position under either Morena, Partido Verde, or like any of the other, like I think Partido Trabajador, which is the left wing mega coalition. She was able to get it passed anyway, so they're going to be auditing the water anyway. The taxes on Jalisco water, though, have been raised by 76%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, water is a human right, and that's like one of the biggest platform elements for Morena. So they're really, really pushing for this to be reformed in some capacity. And what's interesting is that Jalisco is controlled by Movimiento Ciudadano, and they are really, really pushing back on this audit. They're like obviously trying to hide something. So it sounds to me like the only reason it might have increased is because of fraud. Some kind of fraudulent activities happening here.
Somebody's making some money, huh?
Somebody's making some money, probably cartel, to be
Hmm.
honest. Probably cartel.
Yeah.
And or maybe what they'll find is that there are some crops. Rancho Isaguirre was in Jalisco.
Hmm.
A ranch is not a ranch without water. You need
Mm-hmm.
water
Mm-hmm.
to to have a ranch.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those ranches are not just cows and horses and chickens. They have crops, illegal crops that they're growing out there. So
Mm.
something to consider. It could be that. Could be a lot of things. But either way, they're not letting people do the audit. Very suspicious. We're moving out of the indigenous updates and we're going to talk about the political party moves. So, Guanajuato has rejected the decriminalization of abortion. They are a PAN controlled state, and a Partido Verde congressional official aligned with PAN to prevent the decriminalization. Massive protests erupted in the actual courthouse itself when the decision was announced, and they've broken out in Guerrero in general.
Damn.
Yeah. Claudia Scheinbaum announced a couple days ago that the Ayotzinapa 43 case will move forward under the new justices in the Supreme Court. The prosecution in the original case in Mexico and the families have received report from the president. She states that the justices are giving, with no explanation, acquittals of those involved in the case. She says that this is another reason the reform was a good thing. And relevant to that, not directly, but kind of indirectly, is to the justice reform in general, is that Justice Sandra de Jesus Uniga deterred a plagiarism case through UNAM, failed to provide protection for the parents of the Ayotzinapa 43 students, and also stated last week that people working to reform the federal full work week hours to 40 hours rejected enforcing the measure. The measure has been frozen in court for the last 2 years, thanks to her.
Damn, she said you can't have anything.
Yeah, nothing. No justice for Ayotzinapa 43, and I plagiarized my work at Universidad Autónoma Nacional de Mexico.
Damn, what's she doing?
Well, she didn't learn something, I'll tell you what. She's committing plagiarism. Um,
She like used Chat GPT before it was there, before it existed.
she was probably hiring some poor student to do her work for her.
Yeah,
That's what ChatGPT used to be in the olden times.
yeah,
Is
that's
paying
true.
somebody to do your homework for you,
Yeah,
forcing your boyfriend to do it.
yeah, that's true.
Um, Zionists are making pilgrimages to Latino America, specifically to Chiapas.
Chiapas. Why
Yeah,
Chiapas?
they're taking photo ops and quote unquote helping poor children in Chiapas. The Acción Palestina Chiapas is asking for people to bring attention to this issue. The group is called Héroes for Life. They're
What?
called something else in Hebrew, and it's really funny. They're called like something about the expansion of Israel. It's like really funny. But anyway, they also train dictators. This group,
That's so random.
yeah, and they're looking to expand Israeli relations in the region. Probably some of that millions of dollars for Hasbara went to this program.
Yeah,
Guarantee it.
definitely.
And they're officially a part of that Hasbara programming. So
Hmm.
yeah, look up Acción Palestina Chiapas if you're interested in learning more about that. They're on Instagram, if I'm not mistaken. Now we're going to move into our general topic for today.
Okay, and our general topic for today is leftist conversion therapy, also known as how to radicalize your friends and family.
Perro Güero, this is another topic that he suggested. He was basically asking how to convert specifically Mexican people, but I felt like it would be more useful to talk about everybody and how to address like essentially like a catch-all, right? Every person that you want to radicalize into the left. And we've talked at length about what leftism is. So needless to say, this is not an opportunity for you to try to get your your family members to vote Democrat. So that's something to keep in mind. That's not what this podcast is about. I want to talk about class first. I think it's important to note that, like, a lot of migrants, and particularly Mexican Americans, especially second and third generation, and I'm going to bring up my usual punching bag, Nick Fuentes, a lot of them fully believe that they're white. So this is useful information for migrants who have like assimilated and who believe that they're white or who like espouse the whole like Spanish first rhetoric when it comes to like Mexican Americans in particular who are like I'm Spanish and like I'm proud of my roots. It's useful to deconstruct their internalized racism, but we're not really talking about that right now. We're talking about how to radicalize them into the left. So we're talking about how this applies to their self-perception of whiteness. So when we're talking about class, something to note here is that like white people view themselves as a people who are absent of race and that the black race is the only race. So it's not often useful to talk to white poor people about their race necessarily directly because they have a lot of like racist ideas about what race is because they're white. Like, do you get what I'm trying to say?
Hmm.
So it's important to try to approach poor white people from the vantage point of poverty and like specifically poverty in the context of disparity because I think most white people are like in an economically troubling situation.
Hmm.
And so because of that, it's useful to like know it's useful to know what they're going through as like a demographic. And white people are the biggest political voter bloc in the United States. That's just a fact. They have the biggest political power, and it's important that we, as marginalized people, have the tools to be able to like talk to them and to be able to understand their struggles too. Because even if they might be white, they might not have like a perfect like most white people are not white men. So it's useful, or they're not like white cis perfectly able-bodied Christian men. A lot of them have particular marginalizations that maybe they're not even in tune of or aware of that ultimately could be a part of their marginalization, and it's useful to help them understand those things. And this is like essentially me giving a little bit of a disclaimer, because I think when we think of like white people, we think of them as like the most privileged people, and they are, and when it comes to the context of race. But there are white people who are marginalized, and it's important to like be able to talk to them from the vantage point of poverty, for example, because a lot of race and race relations, racism, patriarchy, a lot of this stuff is agitated by classism and by capitalism, and that's why they view themselves as oppressed, but they don't understand their oppression. They think that they're oppressed because they're white,
Hmm.
and in reality they're oppressed because they're poor and because they live in a capitalist country.
Yeah, I feel like it's helpful to think of if you were to think of yourself, like what radicalized you, because it's everybody for the most part. If you're in this in America and you grow up in America, you usually grow up under the same indoctrination, right? For the most part, and you have to you go through some process where you have to unlearn it, and then you experience some experiences that force you to question your reality, question what you're being taught, question what you're seeing. And it's usually because of adversity, or usually because of identity. Everybody has some moment where they're like, what is actually happening? Right? So you kind of have to lead people to what that experience is.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I think a lot of people don't think really critically about when it comes to whiteness and white people is that this system, we talked a little bit about this in our plantation class, new plantation class episode, but not all white people are capitalists, meaning like they are not able to have ownership in the means of production because they're not generationally wealthy, and they maybe come from like rural poor areas. And particularly when we look at like the Appalachias, the South, and the Midwest, we start to see like these people are incredibly marginalized. Like poverty is rampant, sexual violence is rampant, patriarchy is rampant. There's just like a lot of things that are happening to that community, and because they're not a part of like an overt marginalized class, a lot of the times it kind of goes ignored, but that's not wise for communists, for people who are on the left. If you want to radicalize people, it's not wise to ignore any marginalization for
Hmm.
any people, even if you yourself are more marginalized than that body of people, because that is, you should view that as a window of opportunity
Hmm.
to have a dialogue, to have a communication with these people. This is ultimately, in the United States, the only thing that has worked. It is the only thing that has worked, is to radicalize white people in your benefit, to your benefit. And it's important to help them understand why these systems are in place and why they're in the position that they're in. Right? When you see somebody who's poor, you should help them, but you should say like why they're poor. You should educate them about their poverty. You should educate them about how to learn more about how this infrastructure was set up to continue to ensure that they maintain that state of poverty. So that's kind of like, again, my little disclaimer is that like when I'm talking about class relations, I'm almost always talking about poor white people or people who believe that they themselves are white. I think this is most notable when we have conversations with Mexican Americans in my case, and I say things like white people can't experience racism. I made a TikTok video that said this, and I can't tell you how many Mexican Americans there were who were like, I disagree. they couldn't say why they disagreed, but they did disagree. And they fundamentally didn't understand that white people, first of all, that they themselves were not white people, and that white people are not marginalized for their whiteness. They're not marginalized for their race. And being prejudiced against white people is not racism. A lot of people, I'm not even kidding when I say that there were like at least 10 comments that were like, I disagree, but that's all it said. It'd be like, I disagree. I don't think you're right. That doesn't sound right. Can you like source this? Like so many people, Mexican Americans who like clearly this is like a hit dog holler type of situation
Mhm.
where they have perceived themselves, they have like done some mental gymnastics to like make themselves believe that they themselves are white.
It's so interesting the conflation of that because and this is also an immigrant thing too that happens in Vietnamese culture where the more that you align yourself with whiteness, the more safe it is. But it's like a fake kind of safeness, you know.
Oh yeah, because police persecution still persists for Mexican Americans, particularly men. It's just like really funny to me to hear people Mexican Americans defend white people. And again, like Nick Fuentes, my favorite punching bag, he is a perfect example of this. He believes he's marginalized because he's white, but he's not white and he is marginalized. But this is like one of those things where like they're like kind of self-congratulating and like self-validating, but they don't understand that they're marginalized because they're people of color. Like people don't want to date Nick Fuentes because he has a Mexican looking face. He has ethnic features, not because he's white. But he thinks that he's like a beta male that doesn't look Chad enough. That's not like, eugenics, like structurally like whatever, patriarchal looking enough. Like he fully has bought into like this like white supremacist ideology. And this is like kind of the same thing where like white Mexican Americans think that Spain is like having Spanish heritage is like something to be proud of. It's kind of like if you were like Native American and you were like, wow, I'm so proud of like my British heritage or my German heritage. Like that is it's just really weird.
They got him on a leash.
Yeah, Nick Fuentes is like, yeah, he's my favorite punching bag because he's such a useful tool to like demonstrate what assimilation can do. But anyway, the point being that when we approach trying to introduce people to communism, we have to know what the ideology of that person is. And oftentimes for migrants, they've assimilated to the point where they themselves believe that they're white or white adjacent. And this is like also for Asian people in particular, this is like the model minority myth. They believe that they're white adjacent. This is obviously a political conversation for another time, but in reality, like they are not white adjacent. They are marginalized, and their status as a quote unquote model minority is like very much a tenuous, not consistent place for them to be. And it really depends what class of Asian you are and what the politics are internationally to maintain that status. So that's my caveat here. You have to know what these people identify as, because a lot of the times, even if they're migrants, even if they're people of color, even if they're white, they might not understand that they are marginalized in one way or another. So you have to know where they stand, and you have to also know what their marginalizations actually are so you can correct that information. And also it's a little bit about your approach too. Like people have to be open. You can't like come in and try to like forcibly educate people,
Mhm.
but you should view like poverty and support, like giving support as an opportunity to educate as
Mhm.
well. And that feels a little like vulturistic to me sometimes, where I'm like, I'll like see somebody when they're down and I'm like, have you heard the good word about the Bible of Karl Marx?
Mhm.
But at the same time, like I feel like it's really important to like take the opportunity to be like, I'm a communist and this is why I'm helping you. It's because of my political ideology.
I mean, I feel like, and you said this too, where you could talk about communism and not say that it's communism. And most of the time, people are like, yeah, all that makes sense. It's just that the word communism has such a bad connotation. But you'll find that if you talk about the values and what it looks like, most people are like, oh, yeah, like,
Yeah, well, and this is
yeah,
exactly what
no poverty. That sounds awesome.
and this is what exactly what brings me over to the Young Patriots. We've talked a little bit about the Young Patriots, but they were one third of the key players inside of Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition. The Young Patriots were led by this white Appalachian, a self proclaimed hillbilly. he would say things that were fundamentally in alignment with Marxist Leninism because Fred Hampton got him to read for himself and to his people. So these were like white Confederates, like people who had literally had the Confederate flag, and they became radicalized by their poverty. So Fred Hampton sort of overlooked a lot of their microaggressive symbology, their racism, to be able to bring attention to the fact that like capitalism is the ideology that was behind that. Eventually they abandoned that symbology and they evolved into like an explicit communist group who now still does work in the Appalachias. They're still like radicalized people. Like they're groups that came after them, of course, because I think the Young Patriots themselves don't necessarily exist anymore in that sense. But there are a lot of different groups that exist in the Appalachias and who are like in the Midwest who are doing different support stuff that's explicitly communist. And that's why you get like some hillbilly activists out in the middle of nowhere. And it's because like people understand that poverty is like radicalizing.
Hmm.
When we're talking about class, the best thing that you can do when you're talking to somebody who's class marginalized and you're trying to bring in conversations about communism is to point to people's material conditions and what you think should be different, right? So like if people are like out on the street, they're begging for money, you should be like, I see that you're poor. I see that you're class marginalized. Like use language that maybe they're not familiar with. And I do this thing, you'll probably start to notice it. I learned to do this during my public speaking classes, but I'll say the correct academic term and then I'll follow it up with a layman's terms. It's sort of like I'm defining it with when I'm like having a conversation. And this is because the reason that I do this, especially on my TikTok, is because Mexican Americans are one of the most undereducated demographics in the United States. I understand that like academized language is not something that's accessible to them. Furthermore, it also helps for people who are intellectually disabled in any way. If they don't understand the terminology, the academic terminology, they might have or find that it's more accessible for me to use layman's terms when I'm speaking about something that's like a little bit more complicated.
I think it's a good strategy. I mean, if initially when we were talking about that, I thought you were talking about like talking to people in person.
Well, I think like every avenue of communication is like an avenue of communication. Do you get what I mean? Like I view you've caught me doing this, but whenever I'm in like a ride share and I have like a driver, I always talk to them. I always talk to them. I always talk to my drivers. I always talk to people who are working for me, even if it's like in a temporary capacity, because I understand that like they're workers and that is like an immediate understanding that I have. And based on that, I can talk to them about their marginalization. So I might ask them like, "Oh, like how's your day going? What's work been like?" Like I take an interest in what they're going through. I've been like, "How do you like your work?" And if they tell me that they don't, I'll like make them aware of laws that are like coming down the pipeline or whatever, or I'll make them aware of organizations that are relevant. Like there have been so many times where people have needed legal help and they didn't know where to look. And so I'll point them to like migrant workers' rights organizations, or I'll point them to like leftist organizing groups. Like there are a few Arab drivers that I've had that didn't know how to get connected to like get involved in protests. They maybe don't have phones, so they're not online. And they're like older people who are trying to like make a living and they don't want to look at anything on TikTok because they're already traumatized enough. So I view like every moment that I'm interacting with people as an opportunity to communicate with them about their like material conditions. I'm like a propagandist all the time. At all points in time, I'm a propagandist. And I view every single relationship that I have with other people as a potential moment to like propagandize them with my ideas. Or like if I'm in the room with other scholars, I'll offer my ideas to see if they get challenged. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But that is like also kind of like later on in this episode, we're going to talk about further radicalization. But for the purpose of like most instances, I try to use every single moment that I interact with people as a potential avenue for radicalization.
Hmm.
Social media is obviously like the most obvious one.
Hmm.
But when it comes to class, like most people who are poor can't access education. And how are they going to have an academic understanding of dialectical materialism? Why wouldn't I just say you need to look at like how poor you are and the things that are around you, the things that you can afford historically and now, and how that's relevant to now. And that's what dialectical materialism is. So I'm going to use like layman's language to help them look at what's going on in their life and to help them learn how to self-prescribe what the antidote is.
It's interesting. It's my version of that. Obviously, in therapy, I'm not doing that in the same way. My version of doing that is teaching people choice or teaching people agency, where if someone is telling me about their woes, telling me about their experience with poverty or non-consent or anything like that, I'm like, what would you like to think? What would you like to feel? What would you like to experience? And they're usually like, I don't want to be poor. Or they're like, I don't want to work this job, or I don't want to work this much, or I don't want to work this hard. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a choice you can have. That's a choice you can make. Um, and sometimes people don't realize that they can make that choice. They're just like, they're just conditioned to accept whatever they've been taught to do.
Yeah, that's a little bit about the education system that I do have grievance with. And I would say that's like actually the biggest part that I have grievance with. There's a really good article, a scientific journal actually, written by Jean Anion. It's called The Hidden Curriculum. And it's basically this literature or this idea that the educational system in poor neighborhoods demonstrates that people are taught to be compliant rather than to be questioning of their environment
Hmm.
and questioning of their like work abuse, and they're taught to like cope with that abuse.
Hmm.
You'll see like educators in K through 12 education system who are going to be brutally verbally abusive to the students and expect them to just comply. You'll notice that like especially in the study they showed that students who wanted to use the bathroom at elite schools in like rich neighborhoods, they were allowed more liberty to like get up in the middle of class and go to the bathroom. Whereas like in poor educational system schools and public school systems, the students were expected to have like hall passes or they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom during class at all.
Hmm.
This extends all the way to like academic debate. This is K through 12. This is why it's important because it's children are being indoctrinated with these beliefs.
Hmm.
Little kids are being taught not to argue with their professors at poor schools, but at
Hmm.
elite schools they're allowed to negotiate with with the educator to like get more recess time, get less homework, maybe have a homework question changed. This has like huge implications, by the way, long
Hmm.
term for education. So when we're talking about like class and poverty and how students are educated also, like I do think that having a therapist who's like telling you like actually like this person who was your educator maybe when you were little, who taught you how to like behave in this like very controlled sort of way, to respond in this very specific and controlled sort of way, that person was wrong and you actually are allowed to have a choice and you are allowed to have a opinion that maybe counter indicates this expert's opinion. Like I do think that is a radical thing to do. Maybe it's not as direct, but I think there's so much there.
Maybe I'm doing conversion therapy. Ooh.
Gene Anion's The Hidden Curriculum, the scientific journal, it was a part of the things that radicalized me further into the left, actually. I found the study to be like incredibly grotesque.
It's good. It's a good read for sure.
Yeah, it's really worth reading. If you're interested in it, definitely check it out. I think it's available if you type it in on Scholar, on Google Scholar, it'll come up for free. The PDF will come up for free, so you can just read it. But anyway, that's like kind of like the approach to poverty. But I just wanted to say some like literal techniques here. Whenever I'm talking to somebody who's poor, I tend to like try to give them things, whatever those things might be. If they're like asking for things that they typically can't afford, I will give them those things if I have them. Like one of the experiences that I had more recently, it's like online. I'll have a lot of like inventory for a video game, for example, and people will like ask for things and they'll try to trade things for me, but I might just give them away if I have extras. And I'll say that it's because I'm a communist. That I'm like, I believe that you should have this for free because I'm a communist. I believe that you should have access to this because I'm a communist and it didn't cost me anything to get this item, so you can have it. And a lot of people are really taken aback by this because it doesn't happen in real life as it is. But this I'll also do this with physical materials when I'm around people. I haven't been as much because I'm at university. So it's just really hard to like access this kind of like poor Appalachian person. But generally I'll just like give stuff away and I'll tell them why I'm doing it and I'll tell them why it's like a part of my ideology and I'll be really overt about it because I think like this is an opportunity for me to be like, this is what I believe. And like it also I feel like it kind of normalizes things. And then if people are or begin to express an interest in communist ideology and they're poor and undereducated, I'll offer to read the material with them. I'll send that to them for free, wherever I can find the piece. I generally like to send them the Communist Manifesto because it's propaganda and it's probably the most relatable piece by Marx. And I'll just read it with them. And I'll give like commentary on it and I'll turn it into a conversation rather than just like a lecture so that people can kind of like chew on what they're reading and they can talk about it with me and we can all like form opinions about it. But those are some like more literal tactics that I take, not just like some like reasoning tactics that I take when I'm like engaging people who are poor.
As you can tell, we like to yap.
Based on this podcast, like, this podcast is like a part of our strategy also to radicalize people. Like it is absolutely like a part of it. Having conversations with people is important. So now I want to talk a little bit about culture or race and how to like radicalize people more specifically in alignment with Perro Guaro's commentary. Generally, what I like to do when it comes to radicalization is I like to look at a people and I like to look at their history and how capitalism has harmed them. And I like to disabuse people of myths. One of the myths that I hear most often is that communism has never worked, that there are no communist countries, that China is a capitalist country, things like this. But I like to disabuse people of that very basic material and I like to like redefine what communism is. This is why sometimes you'll find my TikTok to be very repetitive, and it's because I again I repeat things for accessibility purposes so that people know what I'm talking about. So that there's not like a loss in continuity for a single video, if that makes sense. So I'll repeat the definitions of things. I'll say like what communism is. I'll say what leftism is. I'll say what my beliefs are, and I'll back them up as much as I can within a singular moment. And it's useful to repeat this because it's also like a good exercise generally, and it also keeps you oriented towards like your goal. But the biggest benefit of all of it is that you're able to like point to the myths that people are indoctrinated with, like Red Scare propaganda that they've been completely involved in. And then the next thing that I like to do is I like to look at their people's history. And for Mexican people, the obvious choices are the Mexican student movement, which it peaked during the Mexican Dirty War on leftist student movements, which was in 1968. So the 1960s is when it like officially technically the Mexican Dirty War happened. Most people don't know that the Mexican Dirty War was quite literally a state response by the United States to suppress leftist student movements, specifically the Communist Party of Mexico. And when I tell people this information, they're usually pretty shocked. They usually don't know that information, especially migrants, especially second or third gen. They don't know that the Ayotzinapa 43 killings and the Tlatelolco massacre were directly connected to the communist parties. And in fact, if you look at like the murals at the normal university for the Ayotzinapa students, you will see that their murals are all of like Marx, Lenin, Stalin, like Du Bois, Trotsky's even on there sometimes. Like you see all these like leftist political leaders, like it has specific implications why these students were killed. There's specific political implications. And when you start to show people that this is like what's happening to leftists, you have to ask them a few questions. And like one of the ones I like to ask them is like, why do you think that if communism didn't work, that the state, the American state, likes to suppress leftist student movements like this? If it doesn't work, why wouldn't a state let people through self-determination, make these choices to try it out? Why wouldn't they allow for other people to try things out? So I start with that generally. And then the next thing that I'll do is I'll talk about like harms that have come from the state. One of them being the most obvious for Mexican people, cartels. And we've seen that like cartels have direct ties to American intervention. We see that like weapons coming down the pipeline are almost always like 90% of the time or above traced to the United States. And I'm like, why would that happen? Why does the United States have to have these cartels in Mexico? What benefit do they have? And almost always you can pretty easily point to the fact that it's capitalism that quite literally directly ties the cartel activity to the United States. It's because resources in Mexico, available in Mexico, are going to become cheaper and cheaper if the economy is destabilized and the US is able to more rapidly accessibly purchase and take those resources from marginalized people. And who does the marginalizing? The US. It's a self fulfilling cycle of capitalism that only benefits imperial states who have legitimate military superpowers because there's no way for these other smaller states to resist them. So when you like start to like kind of like lead people from point A to point B and you educate them, this is like the best way to radicalize people because you have to show them their history. And as soon as people know history, I will tell you if like people have an accurate understanding of Mexican history, Mexican Americans in particular, they would all be radicals. They would all be radicals.
Yeah, and for Vietnam, it's kind of similar to kind of look for start with a common history. There's a lot of contention between Vietnamese people in Vietnam and Vietnamese people in America because a lot of the Vietnamese people that left, the refugees that left after the war, were people who were fleeing. So these were like the capitalists, right? The South Vietnamese people who ended up having to go to America, go to the Philippines, go to other parts of the world, and the communists, the North Vietnamese people, were mostly the people who stayed, or at least the people who were willing to convert, right, to communism, were the people who stayed. Um, but it is indisputable, and regardless of whether you're pro or anti-communism, that it is a miracle that Vietnamese people defeated the U.S. military, and every Vietnamese person would agree with you on that. And that's a good place to start, I would say. And I think we were talking about this the other day too, about how Hamas is taking a page out of the Viet Cong's book with the tunnels and the psychological warfare and all of that. Because it's Vietnam's the only country who has been able to do that to American military forces, which is crazy. It's insane. There's just like jungle people with guns for sure, but like mostly agrarian.
Rural village people, mostly, that were being attacked also.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a good place to start. Finding some that's something that almost all Vietnamese people can agree on. Is that like that was some crazy shit.
Hmm.
Another talking point I would say is what would life be like without the war? And most Vietnamese people would probably say that they wouldn't be here. They probably wouldn't be in America. They probably wouldn't be like all these other places in the world. And that's I would say, a pretty like easy thing for most people to admit too. And it wasn't that long ago, the war. So almost every first generation Vietnamese person has some working memory of the war and what it was like. It's just about talking about it.
How
But
do you address how do you address anti-China sentiment for Vietnamese people? Because I think a lot of them we've talked a little bit about this actually at length in our previous podcast, but like a lot of Vietnamese people suffered under Chinese attempts at helping divert the Yankee. Naturally, you can't like negate that for a lot of Vietnamese people, they experienced harm from China. So how do you explain that to them?
see, most of the anti-China sentiment is from South Vietnam, like the side that sided with America. China supported a lot of the communist effort, of course, the North Vietnam. side, and I don't know. It's a hard conversation. I think it's like between if you had to choose between China and the U.S., right? Is where the conversation typically goes. Would you rather choose China or America? And when you compare it like that, the choice is pretty obvious.
What do you well, how would you say to Vietnamese people like well, I guess maybe my question is it useful to ask Vietnamese people what Vietnam would look like without US intervention?
I would say so. I would say so. I actually haven't had that conversation. That would be an interesting question to ask. If I had asked, if I could ask something like, if it was Chinese intervention instead instead of U.S. intervention, what
Well,
that would have looked like.
the other thing is that China doesn't currently meddle in any affairs. They've transitioned into an anti-colonial explicitly an anti-colonial structure. So
Hmm.
they don't participate in any colonial ventures. They are very aggressively territorial over the ocean,
Hmm.
the South China Sea,
That's true.
because they're worried about another US military base, and Vietnam is experiencing quite a bit of American intervention currently in government. This is why they had the recent Israeli contract that they forged.
Hmm.
But I think like the question I guess is like would you choose between an evil that objectively is no longer doing evil, or would you like choose between an evil that is like explicitly corrupting your government? This is kind of like the conversation that is similar to like Mexican people, where we like have to like show that like the PRI is a very different government than the Morena government.
Hmm.
And like Morena is explicitly not backed by the United States, and the PRI was.
Hmm.
And the kind of like the inverse is happening in Vietnam, where like the previous Vietnamese government that was in bed with China is was a lot more safe than the
Hmm.
current government that's in bed with the US.
Yeah. I mean, to us, it's obvious. The choice is obvious,
Yeah.
right?
I guess my question would be like it feels a little bit harder to define for Vietnamese people because China is their next door neighbor.
Hmm.
And unless they're Vietnamese people who regularly visit Vietnam, then it'd be really, really hard to demonstrate because the objective fact is that like China has invested a massive amount into Vietnam and the US has not invested in
Hmm.
Vietnam
That's true.
significantly. Mostly the US has tried to like coerce Vietnam out of its resources, which is like what the whole Vietnamese genocide was about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the other piece too, since we're living in America, is that most of the Vietnamese people that we are surrounded by are people who are Vietnamese people who are pro-America, is the truth. So that's just the reality of the exposure that we get.
This al-
So,
this also reminds me, another commenter asked me to talk about China a little bit, and I'm
mhm,
not Chinese, so I can share very little, but I can say this, and but this reminds me of this conversation that I've been meaning to sort of bring into this podcast anyway. The perception of most Chinese Americans who have never gone back to China remember China during its developing stages.
mhm,
They remember what early communist China looks like, which
mhm,
was not positive.
mhm,
Transitioning out of like a revolution is hard on the economy. It doesn't matter like if it's a good revolution or a bad revolution. It's hard on the
yeah,
economy. A fascist revolution is hard on the economy as much as a communist revolution is. The fact
yeah,
that's the fact of the matter. So they what they remember is like a post Mao PRC is new, sort of like there's still a lot of corruption, there's still a lot of capitalists who are still like marginalizing the poor, and that's their perception, and that's ultimately why they had to leave.
mhm,
And because that is their perception and they haven't gone back, they don't know that Chongqing is like referred to as one of the like most technologically advanced cities in the world. They don't know
mhm,
about Chengdu, Sichuan, and like all of the things that the Chinese government has done to reform all of these sort of negative outcomes of the revolution.
mhm,
They don't know that. They don't recognize that China. And I think that's the same thing that's happening with Vietnamese people. They
mhm,
don't recognize a Vietnam that's like the north of Vietnam looks very different also, quite literally in terms of corruption. it looks very differently. Their infrastructure is better in the north of Vietnam than it
Mm.
is in the south. And I think that speaks to like collusion with the American government versus working with the Chinese government overtly because they have the best Chinese governmental infrastructure programs in the north of Vietnam.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So maybe like that's like a part of it is also like showing that like certain parts of Vietnam that have been aided by China look very different
Hmm.
and that capitalism because capitalism offers a very shiny exterior, to
It
be
really
honest.
does.
Yeah.
America, I mean, that's what the American dream is, That's that was marketed. That's what is marketed to a lot of immigrants.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of like this is also happens to Mexican Americans where they like view their indigenous like huts as fundamentally primitive and
Mm,
they view it as like a racist they view it from the racist lens
right.
and they view these like plastic houses that are like extremely flammable.
They all look the same. Yeah.
Yeah, they all look the same as like this perfect
Mm-mm.
life. They're white picket fence and they're like grass that's like invasive and like horrible for the environment.
Yeah, it's so
they
sad.
their perception of like what is like a good life is a completely different perception of like what I think is a good life. Like I'm gonna choose to live in my adobe hut any day of the week
Yeah,
because the air is clearer, because the life is better,
right.
because it's more peaceful, because I don't have to like compete with my fellow man. I'm like not like in a rat race and the things that are around me are organic. They're not made out of plastic. My house is not going to burn on fire and like combust because, it's made out of like foam and like carcinogens.
Hmm.
Like I just think like that's also like another thing is like perspective is really important. So like you have to like really take into account like what people think of their home country.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
It really is. But I mean, it's useful in this context because talking about race relations when we're talking about like radicalization, it's important to like point to why people view their country the way that they do and more importantly what the US and other western countries have done to those countries. Like I think maybe there's something here, but I really don't know because I'm not Vietnamese. But like maybe it'd be useful for like Chinese people to point to the British colonial system and for Vietnamese people to point to the French.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, what was it? I know there was a period of the Red Scare that was right before the Vietnam War, and I think before that was the Cold War, and then before that was it like World War I or
Well, the
something?
Cold War happened after World War II. So it would have been World War II. Because, okay, so the World War One happened in the 1910s. And then World War II happened in the 1930s to the 1940s.
Oh, okay, okay.
And the genocide on Vietnam, when did that happen? It's
And
the
it
19.
ended in the 70s,
Yeah, so it was
1970 or
after.
something.
So yeah, it would have been after the Cold War.
Yeah, it was right after the Cold War. I don't know. It was shitty. It was just the one thing after the other, honestly, for Vietnam. And I remember after the Vietnam War, it took a long time to recover.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people that's what they remember. I think a
Hmm.
lot of Vietnamese Americans, that's what they're thinking of when they think of like communist Vietnam.
Yeah, it was partially because of Agent Orange, to be honest. There's still some out there too. There's still some like, was it mines or the bombs that are unexploded? But Agent Orange really did quite a number.
That should be radicalizing for people here too, because the soldiers that had to deploy the Agent Orange, they,
They got fucked up.
yeah, I actually knew somebody whose dad died of cancer because he was a part of the genocide on Vietnam. He was a British military soldier. His wife was Filipino also, and he like talked about it until the day that he died, but he died because of Agent Orange. He got cancer because of it. He died really early too, died in his 50s.
Hmm.
He talked to me about it for a long time, what happened to Vietnamese people. That's the only reason that I had any awareness of it. He lived with a lot of regret. He talked about Agent Orange and like veterans rights and all this other stuff. That's another way to radicalize people, military people, very radicalizable, I will say.
Yeah, that's true.
Very radicalizable group of people. Veterans in particular, anybody on the reserves also, especially if they're seeing what's happening in Gaza right now. And I will always take the opportunity to plug Eyes Left, which is Mike Prisoner's podcast. He talks a lot about different leftist movements inside of the veterans sort of world and like military in general. And he talks about a lot of like the policies that are coming down the pipeline. Veterans are very useful people to have on your side
Hmm.
because they're probably one of the most neglected working class groups of people besides sex workers. I would actually put them like neck and neck in terms of like how the state treats with them. That's why you see like homeless sex workers and homeless veterans and they're like on the same street. It's because the
Hmm.
state treats them the same,
Hmm.
and it's because veterans hold all the secrets of the empire. And one final note here that I think is important when we're talking about communism and like radicalizing people, there's something to be said about deference politics. So we've talked at length about what deference politics are on this podcast, but just to kind of reiterate, deference politics are sort of hand in hand with identity reductionism. So essentially, when like somebody tries to hold somebody else accountable, if they're not maybe a member of that community and they're like a marginalized community, it's really hard to hold people accountable because they'll say that like because of their marginalized identity they can't be held accountable, or because of their marginalized identity that they're more right and that you should defer to them, aka deference politics, that you should basically default to whatever opinion they might have because they're marginalized. For the context here, if I, for example, am arguing with somebody black about wanting to bring them into a more radical school of thought, it's going to be really hard for me to be able to do that because a lot of them are, especially radical liberals, they're really convicted in their beliefs about politics and they don't necessarily have an interest in hearing somebody out that isn't a part of their people group. So deference politics can be potentially a neutral term, meaning that like you can interpret it as like an opening for propaganda. It just can't come from you, meaning that like me and you, we might not be able to appeal to this person culturally, but we can give other black leftists, black communists, people the tools and the information to like go and look into their history to be able to radicalize people to the left. And the most obvious choice for that is to talk about the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement. Some of the narratives that I hear a lot about the Black Panther Party is that they were inherently misogynistic, but one of the things that I think a lot of people don't talk about them is that they were actually actively working on their misogyny. That was a part of the things that they were working on before they were dismantled by the FBI and through the programming. And also a part of the misogyny that existed in the Black Panther Party was in part because of COINTELPRO propaganda. Like one of the narratives that COINTELPRO used most frequently against the Black Panther Party was that their partners were cheating on them, that their babies weren't their babies, like all this like random stuff that was being made up about them. And a lot of the people who were sharing this information were people who are of the same identity. There were people who were technically inside of the Black Panther Party. They were FBI operatives that were working for the state, but they were in the Black Panther Party. So I think that's pretty interesting. I think it's like a quick note here that if you're talking with somebody who's like either believes that they're more marginalized than you or like is objectively more marginalized than you, a lot of times it's going to be really hard to access them and they might be really convicted. So it's a good time to tap on a comrade and to have somebody who's like culturally competent to talk about that particular issue or maybe that like particular idea, and to disabuse people of misinformation about history and their context and stuff like
Difference politics or defense mechanism?
that. Yeah, I mean, because the
Spot
thing
the difference.
I think the thing is that like me, for example, if I was arguing with somebody, and I mean arguing in the academic sense, right? Like if I was arguing with somebody who was black and they were like, I don't want to listen to you because you're light skinned, because you are white, maybe a lot of the times when I'm arguing with radical liberals, they accuse me of being white, even though I'm indigenous. And they weaponize my identity against me. And that's when I think it's useful to have somebody who is in your sphere who can maybe respond to those accusations. Like you should be friends with a variety of different people as leftists and you should organize with them so that that way when there's a member of their community that like is totally propagandized, that they're able to see that this is not your ideology, that this is the ideology of like the black radical tradition, for example. And this is like honestly what happens to Madeline Pendleton every other Tuesday. They get accused all the time of not being equipped to talk about the black radical tradition, even though Madeline is objectively one of the people that I would say does probably some of the most extensive research about the history of the Black Panthers and like communism in the United States. Despite this, because they're not black, it's really hard for people to hear what Madeline has to say. It's interesting because I find that I've learned from Madeline's videos, so I'm biased in this way. Like I'll hear something that Madeline will say, and I'm like, oh my god, this is such a good source. I'm gonna go and read up on this. And like they're probably one of the only people that I see online that consistently sources legitimate academic texts about like US intervention and stuff like that. And I find that to be really, really useful. Whereas like despite the fact that this happens, radical liberal content creators tend to get a much bigger audience of black radical liberals because they're black. And the fact is that even though they are antithetical to the black radical tradition in terms of being literal liberals, despite this, because Madeline is not black, they're not going to be listened to. But we can do two things about that. We can be mad about that, which I don't think is like a useful tool. I don't think it's useful to just be mad about it. I think the fact is that the black community has experienced so much harm from white people that it'd be really hard for them to like change their ideology overnight. Like and to like suddenly have rapport with white leftists. Like I don't necessarily think that that's like a reasonable expectation for the black community either. So I think it makes more sense to like get other parties involved who are of the same identity of the person who's like espousing incorrect information. So that's my little note here about race and deference politics and identity reductionism. Don't try to negotiate with people on their identity because a lot of the times it's not something that is possible. It doesn't mean it's not worth trying. There are a lot of people who are very open minded. Like the black community is definitely not monolith, and I've found that like especially people who have an interest, if you can cite your sources, they're not going to care what your identity is as long as you can like prove what you're saying. Because a lot of black women in particular are academized, so they will respect what the literature says, and they don't care if it's coming from you. But that being said, there are still like a lot of people who are not academized and who don't necessarily believe these things and who don't necessarily care if it's coming from somebody that isn't black. So that's my little caveat here. Would you say that that's true for the Asian community?
It's true in the sense that, like, I don't know, I feel like Vietnamese people will find any reason to not listen to somebody. The main the main excuse is if they're not in your family.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if they're not in your family, then they can't say anything. Or there's a lot of it has to do with age too. So if you're younger than them, then they'll write you off.
That is super interesting.
They're very ageist.
I find that like the Mexican community is really pluralist about me. The Mexican American community, I should say. The Mexican community doesn't bother with me at all because they know that what I'm saying is true, so they just like don't. Most of my following are not Mexicans from Mexico. Most of them are Mexican Americans. Every once in a blue moon, I'll get a right-wing Mexican living in Mexico who's like from the city who
That's
will
crazy.
yeah, who will accuse me of being like anti-American, who will accuse me of being like
You're
anti-American,
like,
who
and?
yeah, and they'll
Correct.
yeah, right. And they'll accuse me of just like being complicit in leftist propaganda and like all this, but most leftists living in Mexico do not bother with me whatsoever because they get my goal. I've only had like two or three people, and then sometimes I get people who are like center left, who are like almost liberals, who are on the border states because their experience with the cartels is a lot more brutal and a lot more overt. So for them, the anti-America, pro-Mexican government propaganda is not working for them because their lived experience is just like it doesn't align with 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 my like what I'm saying.
Hmm.
For them, America good, Mexico bad. And so they can't reconcile like like what I'm saying with leftism. Like they because they're like technically more on the left than I am. But my concern is much more with American imperialism on Mexico, and their concern is a lot more with the Mexican government. So, outside of that, though, most Mexican people in Mexico really do not bother with me at all. They're like doing their own thing. Mexican Americans, however, I get like a mixed bag. I get like old school classic Chicanos. And by the way, Chicano was a re indigenization movement, so that's why like people who are educated about Chicanismo,
Mhm.
they actually do believe in like the indigenization of Mexican people and the rejection of whiteness. So those types who are like educated about their history and who know where Chicanismo comes from, those types are totally invested in my channel. And a lot of elders will say like thank you, like we're so lucky, like we have like a young person, like I get stitches from cholo sometimes that are like wow, like the youth is inspiring. And then every once in a while, I get my usual punching bag type. I get a Nick Fuentes who will be
Mhm.
like pro Spanish, whatever, and it's like some Tex Mex, like Mexican American
Not the
white
Tex-Mex.
person. Yeah, no Tex Mex. Tex Mex. I get a lot of. I have a lot of problems with Tex Mex Mexican Americans. They really do. They've really adopted like a lot of like MAGA talking points and stuff like that. So I get some of that as well. But it's interesting because I punch down, oh, well, I punch up a lot at the liberal parties because they're more likely to intervene in Mexico, and that's just an objective fact. Because I would say that Republicans are a lot more overt about their intentions with Mexico. So they're like a lot more like clear about like what they want to do to Mexico. They're not like lying about what they want to do. Like Trump is like,
Mhm.
I want to send military, American military to Mexico to like classify these cartels as like gangs or whatever,
Mhm.
and or terrorists or whatever. And then the Democrats, they'll just like stage a coup through a proxy state like Ecuador.
That is true. They're that I will give the Republicans that they're more upfront about what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, and so because of that, I get like a lot of conservatives who follow me. And I think
Mm.
that's like probably the most surprising for a lot of people is that I have like a pretty blended bag of followers. Like I have some people who are like very much MAGA in the MAGA camp. I have
Mhm.
some who are very much like, ultra blue MAGA. They're on the other camp. And then I have a lot of like random communists. And I think everybody's kind of like picked up on my agenda, except for like everybody who's probably listening to this podcast has probably picked up that like I'm just anti-American imperialism, and that comes first for me.
Reasonable.
Yeah, and I think that is like why for a lot of Mexican people there's just like a lot of pluralism. And I would say that's true for the Black community as well. There's like a lot of pluralism, so it's important to have representation when it comes to when you're addressing specific communities because it also just like it provides depth and color to your argument to like really like have somebody who's like backing up your arguments not just from the academic perspective but as well from like the anecdotal perspective.
Yeah. I think there's some like, and maybe this is my therapy brain, and this is like distress tolerance, right? It's the idea that you can be wrong. It's like the idea that, you know, you can be wrong and everything will be okay.
Yeah, and I think that it's easier to hear that you might be wrong from your own people.
Mm.
And this is like the whole concept of cultural competence. Like you can lean into deference politics.
Hmm.
If people are being identity reductionist, if they're like, I don't want to hear it from you because you're white, I don't want to hear it from you because you're Asian, fine. I'll have somebody who looks like you tell you the same thing.
Hmm.
Fine. That can be a weapon of its own. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So like you don't have to lean away from that. You just have to understand it. And that is useful for a variety of different arguments that you might have online or otherwise, especially if you're trying to like bring people into your camp. If that's like your goal, if you're trying to radicalize people in your space, your family, your friends, then it's useful to talk about these things. But if those people don't look like you, it's going to be a lot harder to access them. And that's just a fact.
Mm.
All right. What have your experiences been? Like, mostly, I would say that my experiences have been with trans people in my community, that most of them already are communists. But every once in a while, I run into like these radical liberal trans people, and I'm always like a little bit shocked.
I find that this is a really good situation in which I think we talked a little bit about this last time where like these are where there are liberals that don't realize that they're liberals.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I would say the trans community is really, really guilty of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is like with white trans people especially, where they really center their transness as like the center of their oppression and nothing else. It like absolves them of all of their other privileges.
I have a question for you because you work so much with trans people and I like barely see anybody in real life ever. Um, would you say that it's coming more from trans men or trans masks, or is it like coming more from like trans femmes or like non-binary people? Like is there a group that's like more inside of the trans community that's more likely to like be liberal about some of their ideas?
I think it's all of them, honestly.
Really?
None of them really stand out to me. No, I think that yeah, I don't know. I don't. I think it's all of them. I don't
That's
think it's
super interesting.
particular to any one like subcategory, I guess, of trans person.
That's really interesting because you probably know this, but I'm just going to reiterate for people, especially trans people that are listening. The entire trans movement that started Pride, right, Stonewall and all of this, was started by Marsha P. and Sylvia Rivera, who are socialists. And by the way, Fred Hampton, the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, he endorsed trans liberation. He endorsed the Gay Rights Now movement. That was like something that he explicitly wanted to like be a part of. And I think that's super interesting because I think a lot of people view Marsha P and Sylvia as like people who were only fighting for gay liberation, but they were actually women who objectively were socialists. They objectively believed in in the betterment of a social and economic structure because they were sex workers. They were facing a lot of inequality. And I think it's really interesting that like what we could say is a Marxist Leninist social movement like the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement objectively endorsed and supported these trans women who were sex workers who were like in a lot of ways like some of them like most um persecuted, like witch hunted types of individuals in modern society. Like today, if they were still alive, they would still be heavily persecuted in the same way, pretty much.
Mm.
Like I think it's interesting that trans people don't know that about them.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of what we're talking about today, like the conversion therapy, leftist conversion therapy, transness is a good avenue to oppression because, obviously today there's a lot of oppression, right, for transness. There's also a lot of privilege depending on where you are in the country. A lot of people use their transness as like, I don't know what the word is. It's like they're like fleeing the country. I see a lot of white trans people fleeing the country.
What do you think about that? What does that make you feel?
I think it's a little, I don't know. I'm like, all the brown people are still here, you
It
know?
makes me like a little bit rabid. It makes me mad. Like it actually genuinely makes me so angry.
It's really all the white trans people who have money that are leaving the country.
And everybody else has to stay behind and deal with the
Yes,
aftermath.
right.
And it's mostly like trans people of color who are going to deal with the aftermath.
All the poor people who don't have resources are staying here because there's no choice, really.
The other thing about that that I think about a lot, there needs to be like bodies involved in protests
Right.
to resist it. And so like all these white trans people, they're not the targets. And this is evidenced most clearly by the fact that Israel has protections in place for trans people. But if you're a trans Palestinian, like you are basically going to be decimated by both sides of the war, partially because the occupation is going to target you to turn you against Palestinians, and Palestinians are objectively going to be afraid of you because if you're outed as a trans or a queer person, they know that you're more likely to be deputized by the Israeli state. So I think this is a really interesting thing because when we talk about like trans identity, there's like an alt-right pipeline that's been forcibly formed for trans people in the United States, and that's Israel. It's objectively like Israel is the alt-right pipeline for trans people.
Mm.
And I think a lot about that in the context of revolution. And I I think this is most interesting thing because Judaism is, and I'm a sociologist, okay, so speaking from specific terms, we could make the case that Judaism is an ethnicity. We can make the case that like because they have a shared oppression that they've and now because of Hebrew coming to light that Judaism or sorry, resurfacing as a result of the creation of the Israeli nation state, that Judaism is now an ethnic group. But Judaism is not a race. So, because it's not a race, the way that the society has like weaponized trans people in this context is really really interesting because essentially it's divorced trans people from their other people group and it's given them like a supplanted like a fake racial identity, which is Jewish. And
Hmm.
as a result, they've been coerced into like completely like abandoning any other marginalized identities. And I saw like actually speaking about black folks in particular, there was this black Zionist trans woman that I knew and I didn't realize that she was a Zionist because I like we weren't that close and I would just only occasionally see her post. But her posts were explicitly anti-Palestinian. She was very pro-Israel. She was very pro-apartheid, and her rationale was that it's really really in like close in alignment to the whole ideology behind Israel as a state as a whole, which is like that there needs to be a safe space for Jewish people in the world, and that therefore a nation state needs to exist. But her ideology was that she was a Zionist because she wanted a safe place in the world that was actually just for trans people.
That's wild. I don't get it. That's some crazy mental gymnastics.
Yeah.
Would that be pink washing? What?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's like a textbook definition. Her picture would be there.
That's pretty
If we
wild.
if we were to look up pink washing in Oxford Dictionary, we could put her picture there and she'd be right there. Oh yeah. So like I mean, this is one of those cases where we need a black trans woman who is able to say like actually that is too much. That we don't need a theocratic ethno state for trans people. We need for the rest of the world to be safe for trans women because not all trans women can be there. Not all trans women can be in Palestine and occupy Palestine. And is the cost of trans liberation going to be the creation of a nation state and an ethnic cleansing and genocide of another population that's completely innocent of all of this? Like that is like I don't know. I think about her a lot, by the way, because that is honestly what really put me off to trans people in the US because trans people in the US tend to be very differential and like they tend to really use identity reductionism probably more than any other group.
Hmm.
And that's been my experience with a lot of trans people in the US. And that's not to say all of them. I would say that like the majority of the pro-Palestine movements are headed by radical trans people. So like I'm not even going to say that there isn't pluralism in the community. There absolutely is, but I would say that 9 out of like the 10 trans people that I talk to whenever I used to associate with them on a daily basis, they're all very, very differential, very identity reductionist, very like I'm trans and like I'm extremely marginalized and would often weaponize it for things to be able to get away with things. So and she was like she was actually very sexually violent as well. So a lot of people came out against her later to say that like oh well like she harassed me, she did this or that or the other, and she would say that because she was black and trans that she wasn't capable of doing these things because the power dynamics were not able like she like literally this is literally what she said that because she didn't have institutional or systemic power, that if that were true, that the person that she quote unquote oppressed would have a lot of avenues to resist. So why didn't they?
This is a really similar conversation that happens in like the mental health slash medical fields around trans people, where the idea of trans specialization, where there's like a trans specialist or gender specialist, versus having every provider have some sort of competency, is a common like discourse where like every provider should have some baseline knowledge. Trans people should be able to go anywhere to any provider and
Right.
get care. They shouldn't have to like look for one person to get what they need, you know?
Hmm.
It's a similar concept, right? As having this like state where there's only one place in the world where they can be that is safe.
Right. It's like well, the whole concept of creating a safe space. This is why I have beef with the whole concept of creating safe spaces in general. Safe
Mm,
spaces should be understood as separatist spaces. They should be understood as segregationist spaces.
mm, yeah.
Every space should be a safe space. Every space should be a space in which human beings can exist and can exist without fear of prejudice or marginalization. Their theocratic ethnostates shouldn't exist because they require the genocide of the indigenous population and the exploitation of another population. That is a requisite. They are fundamentally capitalist in nature and they require an apartheid state. That's what's required of them.
Mm,
It's a requirement. An ethno state, a separatist state, it requires apartheid. So and it's interesting because the most marginalized populations are the most likely of reproducing the Lebensraum, which is the German theocratic ethnostate ideology. The most marginalized populations are the ones who are most likely to recreate it because they understand the world as a threat to them. And so the
mm-hmm,
response to that is to create their own ethnostate, their own theocratic ethnostate, their own state for their own reasons, for their own purposes, a separatist state. But in reality, nobody's addressing this systemic elephant in the room, which is apartheid. Apartheid is what allowed for, created, and pushed forward an ideology of harm on another population,
mm,
right? And this is what we saw, like when I talked about how, like in our previous podcast, how like harm is cyclical. This is what I'm talking about, and I'm saying this as a sociologist. Now I'm like really getting into like academic definitions here, but in reality, like people who are deeply marginalized are much more likely to reproduce. Like, give it another 10 years after the genocide in Gaza is put to the extent that it needs to be put, and the state does what it wants to do. Palestinian people are going to start reproducing Lebensraum rhetoric eventually. It's going to happen. And it's something that we need to be prepared for because we need to understand that, like, marginalized people, through their trauma, they're going to speak and they're going to reproduce systems of oppression because that is what they learned from their oppressor.
mm.
That is what they learned. And trans people learn the same things. They're learning from a
That's true.
theocratic ethnostate, which is a Christian, fundamentally nationalist, alt right country, right? The US is, that's what the US is, that their identity is suppressed and oppressed because this state, the United States, is an apartheid country that's made for white people. It's objectively made for white people. White, cis, heterosexual people. Everybody else is not allowed. So the response to that naturally is to create a safe space. And when you take that to the extreme of that ideology, that means like creating a whole state that belongs to you, that's policed by you, that's enforced by you and your
Mm-hmm.
people. And what does that mean? That means that everybody else is not allowed in. That's what a safe space implies.
Mm,
And what is a safe space other than a theocratic ethno state? Like,
damn, that's crazy.
yeah, like it really requires like very minimal unpacking when you start to
It's
like look
like,
at things.
what have I been learning in college about these safe spaces slash theocratic ethno states?
Yeah, whenever you hear people advocating for a separatist, especially marginalized people, when they're advocating for a separatist safe space, you really need to like spell things out for them to be like, do you realize what you're saying? Like, do you know what you're talking about?
And
Yeah, the world should be a safe space, and that is like right now that's currently the response of Palestinians about to Jewish people who are saying like, well, we need an ethno state. Jewish people who are saying that they're hearing from Palestinians, particularly Palestinian Americans. Palestinian Americans are saying, well, why isn't the whole of the world a safe space for Jews? Why isn't the whole of the world a safe space for the indigenous population of such and such? Why isn't the whole world a safe space for Muslims? Why isn't the whole world? And these are questions that like people really need to have in the back of their minds. Like there is no such thing as a safe space. There is no such thing as a safe space. If you are in a space, if you are a living human being, breathing person in a space, you are inherently a threat because of the ideology that you've been indoctrinated with, especially if you're an American.
Mm.
But if you're a modern human being, you have propaganda that's been put in you. Like, we are not perfect vehicles of ideology. So you are inherently an unsafe person. You have some bigotry that you still have left to unpack, and until the day you die, you will have bigotry that you have left to unpack. Nothing is safe. So yeah, anyway, that's our little tangent about safe spaces and deference politics and identity reductionism. I wanted to talk a little bit about disability also. And this is like, again, we're kind of like setting up a model. Hopefully people have picked up on that. There's a model here, which is like you point to history, you show radicals, and you show like you point to contradictions in people's lives historically that are relevant to leftism, right? And I think disability is probably the easiest way because disabled people suffer some of like the worst conditions under capitalism because capitalism argues that disabled people have no utility, that they have no purpose in our society, particularly those that are not able to work.
Mm.
And if you are a disabled person who isn't able to work, if you're intellectually disabled in any capacity, then the state views you as somebody who's an intrinsic like parasite on capitalism. But to me, as a radical, as a leftist, I view people who are weighty on capitalism as a good thing. I view them as inherent marginalized people who are a check on the quality of life because I view disabled people as people who deserve the most in our society because they need it the most. That's the only reason that they deserve it is because they need it,
Mm.
right? And because that's my ideology, when I approach disabled people, they're probably the easiest to radicalize. And that's
Mm.
why Republicans do it too, because Republicans are able to do it through Christianity. They're able to say, well, because I believe in God, I believe that you deserve what you deserve, whatever you might need. Christian ethno national ideology is really prevalent in the right. So it's really easy to radicalize disabled people into the right too. But on the flip side, to be able to point to the contradictions in the quality of life for disabled people in the states, it's it's really handy. And almost always if you address like a plethora of things including disability, most people are like, "Oh my god, like actually I don't have everything I need. There aren't accessible ways for me to get to work. It's not I don't have a job that's accessible to me. I don't have a way to make an income for myself that doesn't involve me doing manual labor." At a time in which AI is developing, you would think that we would develop as human beings artificial intelligence that would allow for disabled people to more meaningfully engage with our society.
Mm.
And this is like a conversation that could also be a whole other podcast. But in reality, like what we're talking about here is like radicalizing disabled people is like probably the easiest. And talking to disabled people of color and pointing out that like they don't have everything that they need and that communism would offer them everything that they need. Like one of the things that I also always like to point out is that we become disabled with age. Like
Mm.
elderly people become disabled with age. That's an intrinsic part of life. Everybody's going to be disabled at some point. And
Mm.
what that means is that we can point to the elderly in our lives, like what kind of care do we want them to have? And do we want them to have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to be able to survive on the day to day? Like that seems very scarcity driven to me.
Mhm.
And so I like to point to other countries. And one of the ones that I think is the most useful is China. China has excellent infrastructure for disabled people that they're institutionalizing actively, and they also have codifications in their law that allow for them to have better care infrastructure for their disabled population. Mexico similarly has begun to take its steps to the left, and as a result, the structure that's in place legally, as well as the literal social structures for disabled people that are being implemented right now, are incredibly mindful of like disabled people, including like building infrastructure as a mandate for workplaces that employ disabled people
Mm.
and credits coming from the government in taxes that are going to help those businesses build those things, which is great for everybody, right? It's great for the business to like maybe you get a little bit of cosmetic help to make the business look better, but also you get to employ disabled people and disabled people get to benefit from that by getting a job and feeling like they are contributing to society if they're able to do that. And then on top of that, there's also infrastructure that's being put into place to help disabled people vote, because by proxy, the indigenous population gets to benefit from that because a lot of them are rural, so it's just not accessible anyway. So they'll bring the electoral booths all the way up to the mountains. They'll bring them to where disabled people are. They'll bring them to where the indigenous people are. So these systems are actually coincidentally taking care of each other too. So like when you take care of marginalized people, these these like kind of overlap. And this is not something that capitalism can address, because capitalism argues that these systems are not useful unless they're profitable. Communism argues that it's profitable and that it's moral to take care of disabled people.
I think there's a cultural piece too. That's like the big difference within China and within Mexico. There's just a culture of taking care of your elders that isn't there as much in America. We have these like nursing homes, and I don't know. It's just I don't know what it is. Maybe it's capitalism is the culture.
Well, even nursing homes in China are free. That's the
Mm.
other thing. Is that like and even it is looked down upon in China to send your parents to a nursing home
Oh
because it
yeah,
shows that your relationship with your parents isn't good,
yeah.
and they blame the youth for that because they have their own social and cultural rationale for that. But in the US, it's usually actually the parents' fault. It's
Mm.
not the fault of the youth. It's a lot of it is indoctrination and propaganda from the elderlies, and they're the ones who have the power to sort of regulate that relationship. But I think that still says a lot. Like, can you imagine telling somebody who's like maybe been struggling with what to do with their very racist grandparent or whatever that China has free nursing homes for their elderly? That would radicalize me for sure. Like when it came to my great grandmother, who is a really, really racist white woman, she she like I would not want to be the person who's responsible for taking care of her. I would leave her to the state because I'm not gonna make myself responsible for somebody who objectively hates me for my indigenous identity. And like I don't know, there's a lot to say about that, but the point is that it would radicalize me to know that there's like a group of people who are willing to do that work for me and who are prepared to make sure that I'm not suffering the consequences of the harm that my grandmother could potentially put me through. And I think that could speak to a lot of Americans who
Hmm.
have homophobic parents, transphobic grandparents, relatives who objectively need care and maybe they want to do the right thing, but they don't have the infrastructure set up to take care of them. Like I think it could be radicalized. I think like disability is like a really big avenue.
It's one of those like you don't know what you don't know situations. I think that's a lot of what can radicalize people is that they don't know what is possible outside of capitalism.
Well,
Because America suppresses a lot of information. It does not benefit from people having knowledge. That's why education is so inaccessible.
right, and that's why like about people's when you're talking about radicalizing people, one of the most useful things to do is understand their identity.
Hmm.
Like you have to understand them. And the minute that you begin to understand them and their marginalization, you can point to what in their lives would be different, and that is an intrinsically radicalizing experience. Not to mention the fact that like having empathy for these people, especially if they've never experienced empathy, this is one of those things where like I think communists, we really belong in the South right now. We really belong in red states. That's
Hmm.
where we need to be because there's a lot of work to be done there because it's like one of the most underserved communities. And it's really a shame because you see people in the Appalachians that are literally being blamed for the elections, and they're being blamed for a variety of things. I promise you most of those people don't vote. They do
Hmm.
not care about what's going on. They are in a crisis in a lot of ways, both because of climate and because of economics, but they're people who really really need help, and they're going to take it from the right-wing Republicans because the right-wing Republicans have the infrastructure set up to help them through Christian soup kitchens,
Hmm.
through donor based sort of like water programs because of God, right?
They are really speaking to them. They're reaching them through the language of Christianity,
Right.
but nothing else really.
Right. But that's like kind of like that metaphor or that however that saying goes where it's like you can give somebody fish, or you can if you teach a man a fish. Do you know what I'm talking about? The
Yeah,
saying that I'm talking
yeah,
about?
you know.
Like that saying where you can give somebody a fish and that's like worth something, but if you teach somebody to fit the fish, that's like a skill for their lifetime or something like that.
Hmm.
And communism is the lifetime skill.
Mm.
Whereas like religious help for this one time, that's like the one fish for the day. And so I think like I want to teach people to fish, you know, I don't want them to rely on systemic injust like systemically unjust systems to get what they need.
Mm.
But anyway, that's my disability piece. We've talked a lot about radicalizing people who are on the right and to the left. But what we haven't talked about is left-wing radicalization. So like trying to push people who are already on the left a little bit more left. And I think one of the ways that is most crucial is that we first have to address like sort of like ideological problems that a lot of people have when it comes to accessibility. And one of them is that like a lot of leftists sort of tend to use a lot of rhetoric and they like get engaged online and maybe they don't like go out to protests. And that has a lot to do with who you're surrounded by. There's actually a few different studies about this, and one of them is about high risk activism. High risk activism being like militarized organizing against the state and like essentially like asymmetrical guerrilla warfare tactics.
Mm.
So there was a Salvadoran guerrilla group that was studied at length by the US for why they were mobilized into participating in high risk activism. And what they found was that most people are not likely to become more radicalized if they don't surround themselves by a community of people who isn't also radical. So if you like marry a partner who doesn't like to go to protests, who doesn't like to strike, who doesn't like to boycott, even if they have like all the rhetoric,
Mm.
if they don't participate with you, it's going to de-radicalize you actually.
Mm.
And you also need a north star, meaning like you need a reason for why you are radical. For them, for these women, a lot of them it was their children.
Mm.
And they found that the only thing that could stop them from participating in this high risk activism was if their child didn't have childcare. So
Mm.
if you are somebody who's an activist who wants to get engaged in activism and you're having a hard time, then you need to tap on your community and you need to be a part of a community. So you need to like find a community that's really active, that's really engaged, and that's doing everything that they need to do. And you need to engage with them and you need to like be able to be motivated by them. And a lot of the times that means relying on people to do things that you don't necessarily feel comfortable asking for help for. And I actually had a really interesting conversation on Hello Kitty Dream Village earlier today. And it was this girl, she was complaining about how like she doesn't drive and how she hated relying on her friends and family to drive her places. And I immediately thought about like how enriching it's been for me. And I know a lot of people hate this about me, but I don't drive either. And for me, relying on my community to drive me places, taking the bus, being in community with people, that has been a very enriching experience for me. Doing ride shares, talking to people during ride shares, like that has been enriching for me objectively. And it's also great for the environment to not have a car, for me to not have a car. So I think like it's important to learn how to rely on your community, and it's important for your community to know that it's okay for you to not have everything together, for your shit to not be together. And that in fact, you shouldn't present yourself as trying to be a perfectly together human being and that you can't always be there. Maybe you can't always be the right person to be there at the right time or whatever. But you should say what you need. Especially when you're in a room full of communists, you should say that like I can't do this. I don't have the motivation to do this. And just be honest and say like you're depressed if you can't get out of bed, if you're having a hard time. Because I you would be surprised like the humanity that people have. There's a lot of communists who will come to your house, who will talk to you, who will bring you things, who will cook for you, who will take care of you. But you have to say what you need from your community. But that will radicalize you for sure. That will be a further radicalizing experience. Relying on other people and having people rely on you. Oh, that's another thing. You got to be dependable. You got
Mm.
to be dependable. If you are
Mhm.
not a dependable person, and you have to be honest if you're not dependable. That's the other thing. It's okay for you to not be a dependable person, but you have to say that. You have to be clear about it and you have to let them know when you're about to be not dependable. You can't just like skip out on people. So, as long as you're like clear and honest about like who you are as a person and what you need, I think it will radicalize you. For me, it's been a really radicalizing and enriching experience to rely on my comrades that are local and to tell them the truth about where I'm at. It's hard. It's raw. It's like a very human thing to be like, I can't do it. I can't get out of bed. I don't feel good. There's just no way for me to do this. I want to be as radical as you. I want to be as able as you, but I'm not. And that was a very radicalizing experience to me. It's also really enriching for me to have disabled friends who can't leave their homes, who can't participate in any kind of activism really, except for like maybe strike and maybe boycott sometimes, because it exposes you to their sense of humanity. And I think that was has been radicalizing for me as well. So that's just my little note on like further radicalizing yourself is like you have to like rely on people in your community.
Mm, yeah. It's not easy, being in community. It's messy. You have to have a little bit of bite to you.
And everybody fights.
Yeah, it's normal.
Everybody fights, and it's okay for everybody to fight. It's just like you have to be really really honest for that fight to be minimized, and you have to be really prepared to have mediated arguments with other people. And you also have to like accept sort of like being wrong often,
Mm.
and you have to be okay with that.
Well, this was a good conversation. I feel like we got a lot of other ideas out of this conversation through our many tangents.
Yeah, anything that shocked you today or new that felt new to you?
There's a lot of new information, as always. Nothing shocking.
All right, well, I think that's the general topic.
Yeah.
If you're curious about what's been going on with me, over the course of the last couple weeks, I've had a few different things happen to me health-wise. One of them was that I caught a pretty gnarly flu, and then I had some kind of other health issue, and I ended up having to go to the hospital. I still actually don't know what the problem was. It was some kind of a issue connected to a surgery that I had a while back. And then on top of that, I also had a colposcopy. So I've just been in and out of the hospital for the last couple weeks. I'm chronically ill. So that plus I'm a student. So forgive me. I'm sorry that sometimes these episodes won't be consistent, but hopefully because there's so much content in this episode, you're happy and and not upset that I wasn't able to publish as much. On top of that, of course, there was what happened to Edward Lynch, which has impacted my mental health more than I would care to admit on my major social media platform. This is because I have been an activist for Black Lives basically since I set foot out of high school. And I'm in my 30s now, so you do the math. And the case of Edward really dredged up some memories for what happened in the case of Stefan Clark. If you don't know about what happened to him, he was killed in Meadowview in Sacramento, and there were massive protests that erupted in Sacramento, and there was a huge amount of police suppression. If you don't know about him, I strongly encourage you to look him up. His case is also kind of like a textbook racial profiling case, and it also kind of demonstrates how neighbors are deputized to surveil their other neighbors. And anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I hope that this was an episode that you enjoyed and that you benefited from. And I just wanted to share what happened and why I didn't release it because I feel like being human with you is important to me. Thanks for tuning in to Liberacion Army Radio. This was episode 10 of our podcast. This episode will air on June 17th, 2025. Today, we talked about all of the actions this week, the Mexican court case at the US Supreme Court against gun manufacturers. We talked about our usual genocide update and a lot of different news coming out of Mexico. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks. Bye.